Mute. There you go. Hi, everyone. I'm Lutfi of the Canadian Urban Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to CUIX Victoria, an initiative undertaken in partnership with the Canadian Urban Institute, together with the City of Victoria and the Victoria Foundation. I'm joined by wonderful panelists tonight, but I want to start this session by acknowledging and respecting the Ḻəŋən peoples on whose traditional territory the City of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Husainish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Through CUIX Local, CUI is connecting with cities across Canada to gather interpretations, data, assessments, priorities, bright spots, and stories from on-the-ground voices to help deepen our collective understanding of the interconnected issues facing urban Canada. We have worked to organize these visits involving a combination of public and invitation-only meetings and activities. And for those of you who don't know what CUI is, we are Canada's Urban Institute. We are a national platform that houses the best in Canadian city building, where policymakers, urban professionals, civic and business leaders, community activists, and academics can learn, share, and collaborate with one another. Before we begin, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items. First, please be aware that the session will be recorded and the chat will be saved. And for those of you who need closed captioning, please look to the bottom of the screen or ask for help in the chat box so our team can help you. In tonight's session, Muslim women from the community will explore themes of Islamophobia, belonging, racism, and safety by sharing their local and global everyday experiences. Inspired by their calls to action from the National Summit on Islamophobia that took place in July 2021, the panel offers concrete recommendations for meaningful action on addressing ongoing faith-based hate, racism, and colonialism on the traditional territories of the Ḻəŋən peoples. This session is rooted in Victoria Foundation's vital signs data, and the data this year show that 23% of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Victoria said they frequently or consistently feel uncomfortable or out of place because of their religion, ethnicity, skin color, culture, race, language, accent, disability, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Addressing this issue is extremely critical for our quest to create more equitable communities and is consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 10, that seeks to reduce inequities within and among countries. And now I would like to introduce our amazing moderator, Asiya Robinson, who has been tirelessly working for justice and equality in her community for a number of years. Asiya, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and introduction. I really appreciate it. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you so very much for joining me today. I'm so grateful to be sitting here and to be a moderator of this amazing panel with all these absolutely incredible Muslim women. I would also really love to acknowledge and respect the territories on which I'm on. So I'm currently located on the territories of the Ḻəŋən peoples, and I have been a guest and most recently an invited guest on these territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Husainish peoples. And it's so important to me, I think, to recognize that, because connecting to Indigenous peoples here and their lands here has helped me connect to my own people home, and that is of the Arawak and the Ḻəŋən peoples from Grand Bahama, from which I was born and raised. And what I really love about the relations of Indigenous peoples that I found here is their ability to accept me for who I am, and that is the Muslim, the Black, the woman, all the intersections, and that which makes me whole. And I hope that through this chat and through this conversation, that is something that you will all also have for not just myself, but for my fellow panelists and all Muslims that you come across in your lifetime and your livelihood. So as the moderator, and as it was mentioned, I'm really just here to facilitate conversation. And so you're going to be hearing personal experiences from these amazing women of what Islamophobia looks like, how it is that they move day to day, and then also, as mentioned, hardcore recommendations, very concrete things that we wish to see. As people who've all lived in Victoria for a number of years, for a wide variety of time, you know, as people here who want to see change, you have youth, who have elders, who have all experienced various degrees of different things. We want to change, and we want to see something different, and we want to be able to continue calling this place home as we currently do. So Islamophobia, I'll just start off with a little bit in terms of what Islamophobia is, which is, I think, to a lot of us, and a lot of us would claim it as something that's rooted in racism, something that is a branch thereof and not really separate from, while not motivated by race in and of itself, instead motivated by religion. And so with that, I would love to turn it over to my panelists here, and I would love to know, who are you? Just kind of self-identify yourself in this space. So Aisha, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Asya. Good evening, folks, and assalamu alaikum. My name is Aisha Azba Amiji, and I am currently speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Malahat Nation. I was born and raised, though, on the unceded traditional territories of the Kwantlen people. And so Kwantlen, also known as Surrey. So Surrey is the city that I was born in, and as well as raised all three of my children. They were all born in Surrey too. So I've lived in Surrey my entire life, except until 2020, when I moved over to the island. So I'll be sharing my experiences as a newcomer to the island and to Victoria. A little bit of background about my professional life. I am a community activist and educator. I teach policy studies and interdisciplinary expressive arts at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And I'm the founder and executive director for Voices of Muslim Women, which is a nonprofit for women's leadership. Does that cover it?
That's amazing, absolutely amazing. Zahira, I'll jump to you.
Thanks, Asiya, and hi everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So I'm a mother, I'm an immigrant, I'm a racialized woman, and I'm a grateful visitor to Turtle Island, and specifically to the ʷəŋən territory. My work in community and in professionally as an assistant teaching professor at UVic centers on anti-racism, on social justice, migration, and xenophobia. And so I speak from a lot of those places here tonight. I also want to acknowledge my privilege as an able-bodied English-speaking, securely housed person. And that means that a lot of what I speak here does come from those spaces of privilege as well. And in recognition that that privilege does shield me from many other vulnerable spaces where we know racism does take place more frequently and more severely. So it's nice to be in conversation with everyone today.
Amazing, thank you so much for touching on that. And Amal? Amr?
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Amal, and I'm first generation Canadian with a Pakistani background. And I was born into a Muslim family. I work in Victoria as a software developer, and I've lived here most of my life. We moved here around 2003, and so I've watched the Muslim community massively grow and morph over that time. I've also spent some time living in Ontario, as well as had the opportunity to spend a significant amount of time going back home and staying in Muslim majority countries. So that's kind of some of the background I come with. And as Zahira was mentioning as well, I do come from I have a lot of privilege in similar ways, able-bodied, English speaking, that obviously affects the way that I see and the experiences that I have. And so there is a lot that, even though I can provide a lot of opinion on things and have had a lot of experiences, I also want to recognize that obviously there is a lot of privilege that my thoughts come from still.
Thank you. Zara?
Hi everyone, assalamu alaikum. I'm Zara. I'm joining you as an uninvited guest from the ʷəŋən speaking peoples territories, specifically the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ nations. I'm joining you again from this space as someone who is a youth and has also grown up in Victoria, but although home for me is actually Pakistan, and I understand the privilege of actually being an immigrant, but not having that immigrant experience because I came here as a baby and I've grown up in the community of Victoria and at the mosque itself, and I've seen it grow as much. And I don't know if anyone else is from Victoria, but we used to be 2 houses and now we are an actual sturdy, stable actual mosque. And so it's been great to be in this community as well. And I'll be coming from that perspective, coming from this community and being here for these many years. And I'm grateful to be in this space with everyone. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And yeah, that's not a perspective I think that many of us have. So it's going to be very interesting to hear that. And then Crystal.
Assalamualaikum, everyone. My name is Crystal. My pronouns are she and her. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the ʷəŋən Nation, also known as Campbell River. These are the lands that I grew up on, although my residence, I am a guest on the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation lands of the Kongan-speaking peoples. I'm fourth generation Ukrainian and Italian from Sicily from my mother Melody, my Nana Peggy, and my Papa Jim. As well, I'm second generation Fijian from Nandi and Suva, Fiji Islands in the South Pacific Ocean, from my father Afzal, my daddy Samshad, and my dada Iqbal. I'm a Gurmitian descendant, meaning that my ancestors were brought from India to Fiji as indentured laborers to harvest sugarcane on British plantations. I locate myself to recall where I've been, where I'm going, and where I am. I'm hijabi Muslim, makeup artist, and third-year gender studies student. And I think that covers everything.
Thank you so much. And I think I'll start with you again. You mentioned that you're talking about, where you've been and kind of where you're going. And I'd love you to reflect a little bit on the past and all of you as you move forward on what is it like to be a Muslim woman in Canada, and take this time obviously to reflect on the fact that a lot of us have lived in different parts of Canada. So do feel free to bring those experiences forward. But when I'm asking about your experience as a Muslim woman, I'm speaking to Islamophobia. I'm speaking to your essence of if there's ever been moments you don't feel safe or you felt supported, and just, speaking a little to that. Crystal.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think like an important thing to remember is that our experiences as Muslim women they're not monolithic. They're going to vary by cultural context, our social context, economic, racial, historical, our abilities. Like there's so many things that, will differentiate our experiences, but we are linked together by like a common faith and a common love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For me, I was not practicing Islam for much of my life until I started to reconnect with my roots a couple years ago. So definitely as I became more visibly Muslim and I started to wear hijab in Victoria, I definitely did notice the difference in how I was treated. In fact, it actually led to making, I experienced times of unsafety in my home life and my work life, just even being out on the streets. It's, already as a woman, there's so many things we have to be aware of and extra precautions we have to take to keep ourselves safe. But when you're visibly Muslim as well, and you're aware of the amount of hate and ignorance towards us, it's just like we're trying to live our lives, we're trying to be joyful, but there's also sort of like this voice in the back of your head, always warning you to be cautious. So I would say that, despite all the cautions and everything, and, how, wearing hijab might mark me as more of a target, there's something about, this faith and even the hijab, like this veil is that keeps me feeling more safe and protected and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's also our guardian and our protector. So ultimately, alhamdulillah, like thank God, I'm Muslim. I'm very, very grateful, and I would not want to be anything or anyone else.
Thank you so much. Yeah, alhamdulillah for all of that. And, I heard you mention the fact that it's not monolithic, and I think that's going to be a shared theme within this, is that while everyone might have experienced Islamophobia to different degrees, it might not be a unique experience between all of us. However, the intersections of our identities does mean that the instances and experiences that we do have do different and do vary based on that. And you were talking about a cautious voice. And it's interesting, sometimes that's an internal voice, and sometimes that also presents as my parents literally messaging me and saying, this thing happened in the world today, be cautious, be aware. And so sometimes it's an internal thing, and sometimes it's quite literally family scared for me kind of just existing. Zara, I'll go to you. What's it like for you, especially growing up in Victoria?
Yeah, growing up, I started wearing the hijab at a really young age. Young for myself, I guess. I started wearing it in grade 6 when you're doing that transition from elementary to middle school, and as we kind of all grow up, you have like changes, and that also happens with me, with the way that people engaged with me and the way that I was kind of interpreted as a young person growing up in this. I have the privilege of having English as my first language, but I was also for some reason put in all the ESL classes, and I saw the frustration of the other students within those classes that were struggling, and I was there put in those spaces and had to be compared to them, even though I had that experience of growing up and learning English as my first language and not having to go through those struggles. So being in those spaces, understanding that it was because of my background of being from Pakistan and because I had a visible Muslim hijab, I had that assumption of needing that extra support. But as I've started to grow up, it's understanding that even as a visible Muslim woman, I'm stepping into spaces. I have to acknowledge that the way that I'm perceived at first glance is without my control, and that people kind of have that stamped assumption of you're oppressed, you're a terrorist, you're backwards. And those are like the things that flash in their brain, and I have no control over that. And I have to go through a process of unlearning with that person when I'm just meeting them and I'm trying to build a relationship with them. And it's something that you have to just like get past a lot, but it's frustrating to have to go through that every single time that you're meeting with someone engaging. And like when I meet a professor, the first thing they do is they kind of enunciate their words a little bit differently because they know that they think that I have the assumption of she doesn't know English, she's new, I need to be a little bit slower with her. And then going through that process, even in university and in a lot of other spaces as well. But I have that privilege of not having to go through as much of those barriers when I'm doing that process as other Muslim women, because we're not a homogenized group. We're not monolithic. We have different ways of engaging that perceived assumption off the first time. So also just engaging with Islamophobia and the way that those instances have come up in my life. I've seen a lot of them when I was younger, supposedly from my schoolmates, pulling off my hijab, yelling, yanking at them, kind of creating conversations like that, but also those explicit ones, and being spit at, being yelled at. And actually, as I was having a conversation with my mom, when I was asked this question in the past, if I've experienced Islamophobia, I actually couldn't rack my brain to anything. And I was like, no, I don't think I actually have. And then she actually had to point out that one day you came home crying because someone spat on you and yelled at you. Do you not remember? And I said, nope, I have no recollection. And to this day, I actually can't remember that instance, but it happened. And it's something that sometimes we just have to like erase out of our mind because it's such a traumatic experience. And as like a young youth living, I just didn't want to remember those types of things. So trying to unlearn my process of the way that I've engaged with Islamophobia is something that I'm starting to grow up and starting to explore a little bit more, but that's my experience so far.
Definitely. Thank you so much. There's so much personal within that. So I really appreciate you being vulnerable in this space. And I think that a couple things stood out for me. And one is the fact that racism isn't about who you are, it's about who you're perceived to be. So it's not about who you are, it's who you're perceived to be. And I think growing up as well, I'm not sure how I engage either, because sometimes I think, okay, well, I can work to kind of break that perception in you. And then I sit back and think, well, is that my job? Is it my job to present myself different than I already have because of a perception that you've built yourself? And I think it's also interesting that maybe younger you didn't even have language to be able to identify what it exactly was that you were experiencing. And I think that's a big part of it. If you don't have the language, how are you supposed to really be able to not just identify, but be able to deal with what's going on? So thank you so much for sharing that, Amal.
Yeah, so for myself and most people I know who live in Victoria or Canada definitely have experienced Islamophobia, and sometimes it comes in like the smaller microaggression things, and then sometimes it's just these outright blatant things. And living in Victoria, like what Zara's saying, like I think for a lot of people would be those physical actions would be really, they'd be really taken aback that, wait, that really happens like here in Victoria. And yeah, it does really happen here in Victoria. It's just we have this perception that like, oh, we're so liberal and all of this, so that doesn't happen here. But it does. So thank you, Zara, for sharing that, because I know it's like not the most comfortable thing all the time to mention those things, but I think it's important for people to hear it. For myself personally, even into my adult life, it feels ridiculous to be saying this, but like I've had friends who are embarrassed to be seen with me in certain areas literally because I'm brown. They still feel that way. And then I've also had people like encouraging me to leave my religion because it's oppressing me. And then in professional senses, there have also been things where people aren't particularly respectful of the religion, or telling me if I ask like, oh, can I use a meeting room to pray in? They say like, oh, well, you can use the stairwell and pieces like that. But then I've also feel like I've been so lucky to have experiences where I ask to use a meeting room to pray in, and they say like, hey, no, actually we have this other room that'll be a lot more comfortable for you. You know, why don't you pray there? So people going beyond. And then also I just want to recognize that I come from a place where I don't immediately present as visibly Muslim. So I have tons of privilege because of that. Like I get off so much easier than a lot of people because that there's no hijab to pull off of my head. And so, yeah, so unfortunately I watch as a lot of my friends and family go through these acts of Islamophobia, even like just watching my like mother go through situations where people assume that she like can't speak English clearly, or telling her that like, oh, you can't do that here, as if she's like an alien to the area. So that's been both like my personal experience as well as having to watch so many friends go through these hardships at an absolutely another level than me, just because I present less Muslim than they do.
Thank you so much, Amal. And I'm looking at this comment coming in from Zainab about, you know, wearing the niqab and what another added layer of Islamophobia it is that they experience because they are like covering their face and veils and things like that. And so I thank you so much for adding that into the chat there. In addition to that, Amal, I thank you also for sharing that, you know, those experiences that you have where you're denied the things that you need in order to kind of live your life as a Muslim, and then you're also offered them. And you also, speaking of your experience of presenting brown and how people react to that, and even friend circles. I remember I love it when I'm walking and someone randomly gives salams, whether it's like proper salams or do kind of like, it sounds like salams, but you're not really saying it right, but I honor it anyway. And I remember someone offering me salams walking with a friend and me offering it back and walking away, and that friend saying, they assumed I was Muslim because I was with you. I didn't like that too much. I really don't like that. I'm not sure this is something I want. And that was really hard for me to hear. And I didn't know how to feel about that. So yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you so much. Zahira.
Yeah, thanks, Asiya. So a lot of my experiences have been echoed by what the sisters on the panel have said. So I thought I'd take maybe just a slightly different approach and maybe speak from the work that I've been doing and the research on xenophobia and Islamophobia and racism, and what that tells us. And I hope that's a helpful way to frame this conversation as well. So maybe a few things that I'd like to share from that context. The first is, as you know, and as you say, but I think it's worth repeating, that Islamophobia is a form of racism, right? It's part of this broader category of hate that exists out there. And it's more than that, it's also a hate crime. So it's an act of doing something that's meant to be illegal, that society is categorically states has no place within us. And so, like other forms of racism, I think it's also important to recognize that Islamophobia is every day. It's ongoing, as you've heard from what sisters have been sharing. It is an ongoing part of our lives where Muslims are othered, as Amal has said. This process of othering, of made to feel like you're inferior, you're different, you're a risk, you in some way don't belong. Islamophobia happens everywhere. It happens all the time, and we're confronted with it online, and that's part of Islamophobia. We don't really talk about that often. It happens in person. It happens in public spaces, in workspaces, and in private interactions between friends, between colleagues, with your landlord, with your neighbor, etc. Like other forms of racism, Islamophobia is structural, it's symbolic, but it can also be casual and subtle. Like, like what Zara says, did that really happen? What was going on there? Like, is it because of me? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because of my skin color? Is it because I'm wearing the hijab? And so often it can also be really confusing and really hurtful as well. It can be purposeful and directed when somebody deliberately yanks off your hijab or points a gun at you or points a weapon at you. But it can also be really subtle, and it can also be really a consequence of ignorance or unconscious bias, misdirected comments or actions and assumptions. It can be very dangerous and very harmful. So I wanted to share some stuff that we know about kind of Islamophobia in Victoria. In summer of 2020, so last year, the Intercultural Association, ICA in Victoria, commissioned a research report on racism. And I was privileged enough to contribute to that, along with us as well as part of that process. And what we found is that racism is an everyday reality for racialized people. For the majority of people who responded to the survey, racism was something that was a normal, everyday part of their realities. And I emphasize this because, as you've heard on the panel, and as you kind of hear as racialized people speak all the time, when there's incidents of Islamophobia or, for example, anti-Black racism, we hear often the response that this is not who we are in Canada, that this is something that's abnormal, this is something that's, that's not common. But it is common. It is an ongoing, everyday reality. We live in a violent and a racist world in which various forms of white supremacy still remain dominant. And Canada is no exception to this global reality. For example, just look at the comments that have been made by Premier Ford in Ontario earlier this week, right? So these things are constantly there. They're in the public discourse, they're in the narrative, and they need to be recognized as such. I think that's an important first step in having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Zahira. I really appreciate the approach that you're taking kind of like holistically about the realities of it. I think people would be shocked to know that more Muslims have been killed in targeted attacks due to Islamophobia than any G7 country. So that's France, that's Italy, that's the UK, the EU, the US, Germany, I believe. And I think that would be completely shocking for people to know that at all, because there is that narrative that it doesn't happen here, and a lot of things don't happen here. And so I think the first step is kind of acknowledging that. And then also you were speaking to, the fear that drives it, as well as the misconceptions and kind of that narrative that we're pushing. And so where are these perceptions coming from? And so I hope to really impact that further as we kind of move forward. So thank you so much. And Aisha, to kind of follow up with you.
Thanks, Asia. I would say that for the most part, I echo a lot of the experiences and sentiments that the sisters have already shared. I would add, I've had a lot of diverse life experiences in that I started wearing hijab when I was in kindergarten. So when I was 5 years old, I went to a private Muslim school in Richmond, BC Muslim school. And so it was part of the uniform, and I was so happy to wear it. As my mother tells me, she started to feel a little bit uncomfortable that I wanted to wear it everywhere. So then she started to wear it just because she felt weird. And but as the years went on, I didn't feel so enthusiastic to wear hijab anymore. And the first conscious memory I have of experiencing Islamophobia is when 9/11 happened, and I was in grade 9. I was a high school student, and it was all over the news channels and the quad or the hallways. I don't think anyone calls it a quad anymore, but generally the gathering space where you eat your lunch. And I remember being so traumatized, especially because this was said by a very cute older boy in high school, but he screamed across the quad, "Osama bin Laden's here," at me. And I just remember sinking so small, and that not only was I embarrassed, but I was just crushed inside. And it had started, when you're in high school, it's a very critical period of your identity formation. And so I didn't have the language to name it then, but it was internalized. It was the start of internalized depression. And what ended up happening is I became hyper aware of my Muslim identity. Before that, because I was born and raised in Surrey, it's a very diverse area to live in, and there's a large South Asian population, especially Punjabi population. And I myself, my parents and grandparents are from the Fiji Islands, and Crystalline did a really good explanation of the Fijian ancestry, so I feel like I don't have to go into that. But for the most part, I just simply felt like I was an other but still accepted. And after 9/11, it became very aware to me that I was a double negative. Not only was I other, but it was a negative other. And I felt that pressure as a teenager and a young adult. And then I just like to, and I went through years of, I wore hijab, I didn't wear hijab, I wore hijab, I even wore niqab at one point. It was a very interesting journey that has led me to my adult life. And now I have 3 children myself, the oldest of which is 10. But just about 5 years ago, when my eldest was 5, we were sitting in a McDonald's in my neighborhood, and I don't wear hijab. And so there's no visible indicators that I'm a Muslim woman. I just look like a South Asian woman. You can't tell what my faith is. But we had 2 groups of high school students in this McDonald's sitting and enjoying their burgers as we're enjoying our filet-o-fishes. And they're just bashing Muslim girls, just saying the most horrible, negative things about Muslim girls. And I look at my daughter's face and I see that sink into her face, that she's 5 years old. She knows she's Muslim. And at that point, I had just finished my master's, where in social justice education, where a lot of my studies had been in internalized oppression and media misrepresentation of Muslims. And I decided at that point I was going to do something about the Islamophobia in my community, because it also paired with, I was teaching a community course in Surrey, and where the Kwantlen Newton campus is, there's a high concentration of Somali, Syrian, and Pakistani students. And those high school students who would come to the university after school for this community course were telling me these alarming Islamophobic incidents happening to them. And I just thought, how is Islamophobia worse for these students than when I was in high school and 9/11 actually happened? It blew my mind and it broke my heart. And that's actually the beginnings of how I ended up to forming the nonprofit I run now, which is Voices of Muslim Women, because it became so apparent that we need safe spaces for Muslim youth to learn about internalized oppression, to be aware of the misrepresentation of Muslims in media, and to really have the tools and language to understand what we are experiencing in real time.
Wow, that was a lot. Thank you so much, Aisha. And I'm so grateful to be a member of Voices of Muslim Women. I think it's an absolutely amazing collective. And I know growing up, it was something that I wish I had. I know talking to my mom, it's something that growing up in the Bahamas, we don't have a Muslim community. And so Islamophobia here and Islamophobia in the Bahamas looks very different. That's a conversation for another time, but I know she would absolutely love a community space like that. And it's so important to be able to have centers like that. And so always inviting her to Zoom conversations. But I would love to turn it to Crystal just before we move on to our next session, because I think that there are so many ways to share a story, ways to share an experience. And I'd love for you to tell us and share with us your story in your, I believe it's a spoken word or a poem, A Quiet Resistance. So if you could just tell us about that and just mystify us all.
Well, I wouldn't say mystify, but thank you for handing that over to me, Asiya. Yeah, so this piece that I wrote called A Quiet Resistance is something that I wrote in response to the space of silence, where a lot of our experiences as Muslim women, and again, I won't speak for all Muslim women because again, all of our experiences do have a lot of variation, but it seems like, in Islam, we really value modesty, and a lot of times that means also taking the higher road. And I found in that space that it also means that people take advantage of that silence or that quiet, and then the narratives that are then told about us do not include our voices and are very skewed by white supremacy and gendered racism and Orientalism. So I wrote this piece trying to find a way where I was acknowledging my resistance within the framework of this faith, and as it was also in connection to my ancestors in Fiji. Yeah, so without further ado, I will begin. We do not have enough to satisfy our bellies. This was the cry of my Gramitian ancestors that broke the British back in colonial Fiji. In 1920, they contested indenture and won. This unfree system of labor agreements was born from intrigue, threats, coercion, and exploitation, permanently severing our ties to land, home, and identity. Many did not survive the journey across the Kalapani, the black water, a passage, a void, a burial ground, swallowed them whole. For what? For sugar, for capital, for empire. Though 1.7 million Indians were displaced from the subcontinent to British colonies worldwide, history as recounted by white, cis, hetero, upper-class men have rendered our stories invisible, but we are far from gone. Indentured laborers, or gurmits, survived against all odds, and their legacies lived in us, their descendants. This piece is dedicated to my Fiji Muslim femmes and their covert resistance under the colonial heteropatriarchy. Their voices may not be noted in text, but their spirits are enclosed in my heart. May we attain liberation in this life before reuniting in the highest levels of Jannah, paradise. Ameen. I have been starved, but I am not starving. This hunger which urges itself inside of me is centuries in the making, rolling over 2 seas, sugar fields, and pine trees. This hunger has threatened steely white bodies from Indian to Pacific oceans, which churn in my veins. I was built on Gramitian resistance, combating imperial intrusions on our land that we can no longer trace, names and faces erased. The colonial state has too long claimed to stake sugar, sugar everywhere, and not a spoonful to taste. We have known hunger, but this mania is uniquely colonial. This white male hysteria being told no, being denied what they freely take. This body is not yours, and my ancestors made that clear. This is one meal you will not dine. This is one circle you will not join. This space that we occupy is sacred, protected, holy, and divine. Don't talk to me about hunger when we have known for centuries. Don't talk to me about hunger when we fast for our Lord from the time the strip of light pierces the horizon until the sun sets and the sky ignites with passion. We abstain for our Creator because His love is greater. You attempted to starve us, but here we are, sitting cross-legged, knee to knee, hand to hand, softly brushing on the earthly floor, dripping in gold and turmeric. This is how we eat. You called us passive. You called us submissive, promiscuous, exotic, and savage. But your insatiable hunger is only savagery I see. Hungry to grow, consume and grow, gorge yourself on our bodies, our labor, our aesthetic. You thought you could starve us into submission, but in turn, we starved you. We withheld our labor, we withheld our sex, we withheld our bodies and denied your chance to binge. The act of not acting was a quiet resistance. Our silence is not dead. It is deadly. It is cunning. It is brave. And it is patient. And it is enough to crumble your corrupt empire. So today, I wear my faith as my armor. I wrap my hijab, eyes closed, murmuring praises to my Lord and asking Him for protection. The sacred garment is a way of being in oneness with the Creator, the gentle, the guardian. This hijab is my shield, and yet when I step out that door every day, it feels like there's a crimson target painted on my head, eyes on me when I look away, some staring me straight in the face as if to tell me, you don't belong here. Both invisible and hypervisible, their bodies crowd me in, push me out into the streets, to the corners of the bus, into the margins. They say we are oppressed, but by who? Faced with slurs, screams, and stalking, violent shootings and murders, this white supremacist violence meant to intimidate, assimilate, and eliminate, and yet we are the terrorists? Sometimes this world is too much. Like that one time my Muslim sister and I drove out to China Beach, seeking refuge from the weight of the world to the freedom of an empty beach and an expansive, undulating tide. In this devotional space, we released our burdens, shared our secrets to a wide open skyline, reveling in the encompassing embrace of the most compassionate, the most loving. Only on the drive back, as we came into cell reception, the text messages started coming in. I'm so sorry to hear about that Muslim family in Ontario. Let me know if there's anything we can do to help. I quickly searched the news headlines as if I were far away. The empty ache where my morning should have been felt wrong, like I was heartless. Was I? But no, I understand as Muslims, we are used to grieving our people in silence, an unseen, perpetual, and collective experience foregrounding how we move in this world. The suffering is usually quiet, but we persist with patience afforded to us by the most merciful, and we still find ways to be grateful, to lean into the fullness of life, because we know that He does not burden us with more than we can bear. But sometimes there's anger, and it appears unexpectedly. Like that time I removed my hijab in the white girl's home and she asked me, so when did you start wearing a scarf for men? Questions like these are rhetorical, not looking for answers because their minds are made up. I was simultaneously burning and frozen, aware that my reply would only serve to reinforce her beliefs about us. I don't remember exactly what I told her, scrambling in that space of presumptions, but this is what I wish I had said. I don't wear the scarf for men. I conceal the rawest parts of myself behind a veil, because that which is sacred, that which is blessed upon me, this beauty and adornment is to be cherished. I am to be cherished. I deserve to be held with love, dignity, and awe. This hijab means I can control what you see, though I cannot control what you perceive. Empowerment for some femmes is exposing the body, a loud display of fesh to dismantle patriarchy, while other resistance is quiet, covert, measured, intentional. Our resistance is about starving the monster in men, and I don't mean the one in storybooks all black and furry with sharp, jagged teeth and a foul stench that clearly marks them as grotesque, wrong, evil. No, I'm talking about the most lethal beasts, the ones that can be externally beautiful, but conceal hardened hearts, rotten intention, and ravenous hungers. These are the beasts we resist. They have paid us no regard. They have taken, pillaged, and fled. They have cracked open our rib cages and left pieces of themselves inside until this home of a body is a prison that we want to escape. They have forced and broken, emptied and hollowed my body and the bodies of my Gurmitian ancestors. They picked their teeth with our bones and tossed them aside, yesterday's lunch. But no, not anymore. Though my anger is justified, I pray He forgives me for it. This is why I withhold my body, my sexuality, and my labor from those who seek to exploit, echoing the resistance of my ancestors. I am joyful, but I'm careful. Alhamdulillah, thank God I'm Muslim, and I know that Allah is the all-hearing, the all-seeing, and the utterly just, and there is no one who can escape His judgment. So I withhold, and I abstain. I fast my hungers to keep me close to Allah, the most glorified, the most high, and to bring me relief in this world of unfettered desires, these desires of cis-white hetero men who attempt to exotify, orientalize, and colonize my body. I resist. I stand and kneel in prayer as I prostrate myself to the master of the entire universe, the one, the infinite, the giver of life. I feel a rush of gratitude and warmth. Quiet knowing overcomes me that whatever the struggle in this worldly life, His mercy is greater. So I ask Him to breathe life into this body once more, wrapping my ribs back together, reciting healing verses from the Quran, and massaging my heart until it beats again. This sound, this rhythm, is the song of my ancestors guiding me home. It is the adhan, the call to prayer enlivening my soul, and it is the voice of the Creator gently urging me to endure. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fill our hearts with belief, uplift us from oppression, and restore justice in this life and the next, so that we may finally know peace. Ameen.
Ameen. Inshallah. Thank you, Crystal. Wow. It's a lot of du'as, a lot of imagery, a lot of to the point things. I'm loving it. It was beautiful. It was really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And yeah, I mean, and even you sharing certain things, it's so interesting because I think you were so wholly Muslim in that piece, you know, praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way that feels comfortable for you, in a way that's open to you. But I think what shocked me going through that is that even today, there were instances where I was in certain sessions and I was speaking up and someone would ask me, what's your view on something? And I wanted to say, well, because I'm Muslim, this is something that I believe, but I removed that point because I didn't know if it'd be accepted in that space. And so I'm grateful that at least this space, if not all spaces, is that space that you feel comfortable to share your true devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So thank you so very much. And with this, you know, everyone's been sharing their experiences, and I'm wondering if maybe we can go back to gallery view if that's possible. But everyone's been sharing their experiences, and I want to go a little deeper. So when it comes to, I feel like Amal and Aisha have really spoken to student experiences as well as Zainab and what it was like in school. And I really heard about just what it's like kind of when you're walking and who it is sees you, and the fact that some of you have children and what it must like to be a Muslim mom, to have to raise kids in this world, children who are Muslim and learning what it's like to be Muslim. And I know what I wanted when I was a kid, but Zara, I'd like to point it to you. People talk about representation all the time. We need representation for this and representation for that, but is there more to it? What are we missing? What's important about representation specifically for Muslims and for Muslim women? What does it look like? And why is it important? So Zara, I'll head back to you.
Great, thanks, Asia. And I'm instilling goosebumps from Crystal's beautiful words. So thank you so much for that, Crystal. It was very grounding to hear you. I think when we start to talk about representation, we have to kind of take a step back and start to unpack Islamophobia and just the kind of systemic nature of it overall. I think it was touched on already by Zahira and Asiya as well, but that Islamophobia is a form of racism because Muslims are kind of imagined as a race, and that we have these shared characteristics of being backwards and terrorists and all of those kind of things that we are encompassed under. And as a society, we've made Muslims as a race. And so this racist model is embedded within colonization, which sees Muslims as uncivilized and violent to justify means of harm and exploitation. And so as we've already voiced this as well, is like when you're homogenizing such a large group of people, you are really understanding that that's how we are being represented in that space because of that means of colonization. And one thing is really clear is that when we're unpacking this process of representation, we have to start at the baseline of just understanding that Muslims are people and we have to humanize them in this process. We are so dehumanized, like other equity deserving groups, that you don't see a human in front of you. You see a figure, a stereotype right in front of you. And that's how we're represented throughout in the media. And when you engage with just a Muslim on that one-on-one level, that's that first interpretation that you see. And so unpacking that understanding of representation is really clear. And when you're in spaces that allow authentic representation, you really challenge that systemic nature, and you kind of understand that Islamophobia and hate attacks are just a symptom of this systemic root of Islamophobia within healthcare, within education, and all of these different spaces overall. And so you allow representation authentically. When it's done authentically, you allow it to introduce the idea of self-representation and agency and voice for Muslim women. And I think that's really clear when we need to step into spaces and media and community spaces to just humanize the people that we're engaging with. And something that I think you can take home today is that there's this really amazing initiative that was done by youth, where they actually took a speech from a very famous Muslim actor. His name is Riz Ahmed, and he did a speech in the House of Commons on diversity on the screen. And so they kind of took that speech and interpreted it in a way to actually test this when you're watching films and when you're actually engaging with media and the way that you're seeing representation on screen. And so they did a test, and and it's something that you can actually search up and you can try yourself at home. And I really do encourage you all to actually enact some of the dialogue that we're having today, is to go and check and see a film, for example. I think there's maybe a couple of films, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but you can check off those boxes of like, when you're talking and you're viewing this person, are they a victim or a perpetrator of terrorism is one of those keys. Are they presented as irrationally angry? Are they presented as suspicious or culturally backwards? Are they a threat to Western life? If the character is male, is he presented as misogynistic? If they're female, is she presented as oppressed? And if you answer yes to any of those things, then that film or TV show or portrayal just fails the test. And so this is also something that that's been used when in the Bechdel test, I believe it's called, when you're understanding gender as well in film. So that's my kind of key understanding of representation. And I think the key takeaway is to make sure that you humanize Muslim women and they feel empowered to belong, and they have that agency and voice to represent themselves. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think it's so interesting how there are so many groups, like you mentioned, so many groups that have been dehumanized within our societies, because we are not the only one, we are not the only example, and it seems to be a constant thing. And there's a lot of things I think that everyone can summarize about what drives that, but it's so interesting that yeah, there's so many groups that we need to humanize because they have been previously dehumanized, and it's because of some sort of label. And I've decided you are therefore Muslim, and because you're Muslim, you have to fit all of these characteristics. And therefore, because you fit these characteristics, I have a right to treat you a certain way. And that's kind of the way that things are presenting. And so it's so interesting. Sometimes things that happen, I sometimes can't wrap my head around it. But thank you so much for that as well. Yeah, representation, a really big thing, and it's interesting. It's just really interesting. Sorry, I got lost in my head there a bit. So Aisha, I'd really love to speak to you about, you mentioned growing up in Surrey. So Victoria has not been the only place that you've called home, and I'd love to know what your experiences were like, what that environment was like, how it kind of compares to Victoria, and just kind of a general sense of how you presented as Muslim in those spaces, and how did that differ?
Sure. So yes, I was born and raised in Surrey, and I've lived there pretty much my whole life until 2020 when I moved over to the island. And I now live in Mill Bay, just moved here this summer, but I spent the year in between in Esquimalt, right by the Gorge River, or the Gorge, it's not a river. I meant the Gorge part. But one thing I will say is the people in Victoria are so friendly. That is the first thing my kids notice. So to be honest, our first expectation or our first impression as a family was, wow, people here slow down and to say hello. And I wasn't anticipating that. So every time anyone stopped and looked at me for longer than I thought was normal, or at my children, I was just like, oh my God, they're trying to kidnap my kids. Like, you know, maybe they're going to say something rude or racist. Like, I'm just prepared to go all mama bear. And of course, you know, sweet Kathy's just like, I love your children. They're so beautiful. And I'm like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? But of course, I do know what's wrong. And it's that I've experienced so many instances where I have had to be cautious and careful, as the sisters have explained in so many ways, right? So that's essentially, like, on one hand, people in Victoria are so nice, and I think there's so much capacity to have Victoria become one of the most diverse and Muslim-friendly cities in Canada. And I think a lot of the differences between my experience in Surrey versus Victoria is that Surrey is a much more diverse city to begin with, between the South Asian community, the Filipino community, Somalian community. Like, we are just a very diverse and fast-paced, fast-growing city. So, for example, our newcomer settlement organization is just a given that you're going to have not just one Arabic speaker, but you're going to have a variety of Muslim settlement workers who speak Urdu, who speak Arabic, who speak Farsi, who speak Hindi. Like, it's these are just things that I didn't realize until I moved to Victoria, that the overwhelming diversity is something that is very specific to Surrey. And very recently, I went back to visit, and I told my mom that, you know, I feel so happy today. And she's like, why? I was like, because I feel like I'm home because I belong. And then I told her the story of my day. And it started off with my car wasn't working. So I went to the local Toyota, and of course I saw someone there, my brother-in-law who works there. And so he was like, hey, you know, she's my cousin sister, like my cousin sister's sis cousin. I was like, oh, I'm confusing. He's my cousin brother-in-law. And anyways, so he was just like, oh, okay. And he was Fijian too. So then he was just like extremely nice. And they like the service was like beyond, and they just like went over and above and had, like, you know, had a conversation with someone. And then I went to the fast food halal place, and they gave me a discount on my burger. And I was like, I got a free upgrade from fries to poutine. And he was like, no charge, because he knows me. And then I went to get my eyebrows done at the beauty salon, and that woman's known me since I was like 16 or something. And she put her hand on my shoulder and was like, how are you? And then I went home, and I was so happy. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you know what the difference is? The whole day people have been acknowledging me, just saying hi to me. And it's just, you know, that's the power of relationships, and saying hi and smiling. And then the absence of it seems like it's not a big deal. But just that one day and experience, I was like, this is what I'm missing. I can walk down the street here and no one's going to say hi to me, and it can kind of break your heart. So, I mean, on the flip side, I do want to recognize that Islanders are just so chill and so friendly to begin with. So I feel like the potential is just is great.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I was wondering if anybody had anything additional they wanted to add on to that. I know, once again, I'll draw it back to just like this concept of the fact that you're a mother, the same as Hira. And so when your children are, you know, growing up, I know both of my parents really thought about what environment would I be in, and how welcome would I be, and what would that look like, and what are the dialogues, or what are people's perceptions around me. And so I think that's such an amazing thing to have community that either know you or know your kids, and there's that welcoming bond that's already there, that either is because they're Muslim or completely absent of the fact that you're Muslim. It's just because you're you and who you are. And I think that's really, really incredible. I was just wondering if there was any other points people wanted to make. And if not, I'd really like to tie to the fact that you felt that as an adult, as a grown woman, existing in this world, clearly a sense of belonging is something that's extremely important to you. And you felt that on a really real scale. And you could sense that kind of going from Victoria to Surrey and back. And I think for youth, I think we really undermine how much belonging is a necessity, how much it adds to who we are, how we grew up, how we are perceived, what we think of ourselves. And I think school is a major, major part of that. And I've heard from a lot of people today about what their experiences in school were like. But Amal, I would really love to throw it to you about school. School is a breeding ground for a lot of things. And it can be a place that like genuinely makes you or breaks you. It can be a place that really shapes your perceptions. It shapes your mindset. And for Muslim people and Muslim children, what's that experience like? And you know, your experiences and the experiences of others, you know, what kinds of things were witnessed, and what kinds of things would you have wanted to see as a student, as a Muslim child within a school?
Yeah, so sorry, just like you were saying, like school as a child, like it's so important to fit in. It's like exactly what you want to be doing. And then as soon as people see you as being like Muslim here, being like usually like ethnic minority, you just have so much to explain. You have like the world to explain. And like you become this point of contact as far as like knowledge of this whole of your religion, your culture, like all these things go. And you're like, I don't know how to explain this stuff. Like I'm just learning this stuff. And some of it, you know, when you're younger, you kind of practice it in somewhat of like what you could describe as a almost cultural way, because you haven't learned the ins and outs of everything. Like Like, why can't you eat the pepperoni pizza? Like, you know, you can't eat it, but like, why can't you? People are asking you, like, why do you pray like that? Like, people are so much more familiar with the way that, like, maybe in Christianity you pray or something like that, that it's like this thing of like, oh, wow, there's a lot of movement happening there. Like, what's going on here? And you don't want to be different. And it's like, you're having to explain all of this, which can be very heavy. And like, one of my experiences that I found interesting was that as adults, and like now when I look back on it, when I meet people from different backgrounds, you're really like enjoy the differences. You're interested in learning about these different things. I remember like when I was in junior school, having teachers who kind of like wanted to watch me pray because they thought it was interesting. But as a kid, like, you don't want that. That's actually like, those differences are quite isolating. Like, you don't want people to draw attention to these things that are different as much as adults. We're like, oh, okay, this is so exciting. Let's celebrate it and all of that. But it's a really fine line between the two. And especially in a place like Victoria, where there isn't as much representation, it can be slightly more isolating because there isn't like this large backing behind you of group of people that you can be like, look, I belong to this group of people and this is how we're different. It's kind of like, okay, you're the representative of this whole group of people, but there's no one really there with you. Like, you may be the only Muslim person at your school easily. I'm just trying to make sure I haven't missed any of my points here. Yeah, so even just, you know, like, you do end up facing bullying as being like a minority. I think it's hard to beat that in anywhere. Like, things like, why are you dressed like that? I remember that being something that for me growing up, like, I went to a school where you wore kilts and I would wear pants, and it was something that kind of constantly came up. I even had like teachers kind of saying to me like, oh, those pants don't suit the regulation, even though it's literally like, okay, you have people who are breaking the uniform who are wearing like a kilt, but because I'm like this other, you decide to pick on me, even though, just make it clear, my pants were fine. They were following the regulation. Yeah, and then not only do you have your schoolmates doing these things, but then also you have these like parents and teachers who are also really unfortunately racist, and they just like, they make these comments to you about like, oh yeah, you're brown, so you'll probably be like married and have 4 kids by the time that you're like 21 or something like that. And it's like, it's just absurd that these things, like, I've watched these things happen and there's no one addressing them. There's no one being like apologizing to the student. Like, God forbid that happens. Yeah, and then as you get older, you realize in all these things of like, when you're trying to explain yourself and all of this, you just kind of start to realize that you're not actually, like, as a Muslim person, you're not, or in a lot of cases, a lot of minorities, you're not free to express yourself in a true, honest way, really. Like, in a lot of ways, you have to be careful about what you're saying. You have to be careful, like, okay, I don't want to wear anything that's too like religious or seeming like, you know, a lot of my friends who are from the Middle East, like, may be uncomfortable wearing certain things that are seen as like Middle Eastern because it associates with terrorism automatically. And it's really sad to be in a space where kids have to be taught to be conscious of those things and taught that, like, hey, I know you're a kid and you just want to assume that everything's going well and fine and everything, but you are a target because of the way you look. And this particularly hits home for me because my youngest brother, he's very brown, and you kind of look at him and I think a lot of people would assume that he's Muslim. And he's still like he just looks at the world through such like rose-colored glasses. And I constantly, like, to his immense annoyance, I am constantly kind of telling him like, hey, like, just be careful. Like, you can't say that, you can't act like that. Like, something as simple as he wanted to take something to school in this like metal briefcase looking thing, and he couldn't find it. And in my heart, I'm like, thank God he couldn't find it, because if you go to school carrying that, like, how many stories have we heard as a Muslim community? Have we heard of people who have gone to school with like a homemade clock that they've made, really excited to show their teacher, who is usually like their best pal and is so excited for them, only for the teacher to like be like, oh my God, that's a bomb, and for the police to be called to the school and all of this. And so I look at my brother who's just like, ooh, like, look, he's kind of this eccentric, nerdy kid who's like excited about his little briefcase. And I'm like, oh, thank God you don't have that, because I don't know what the consequences of that are going to be like for your life at school. I went on for way too long about that, but those are the pieces that I think like exist in the school, that it's such a formative place, and there are so many hardships that kids have to face, from simple things to really complex things, that they have to grow up so fast and understand.
Thank you, Amel. And I don't think you went over it all. I think, you know, the school ground really is that place. It's such a quintessential place for so many people, so many kids. And it's so frustrating. I have had so many experiences, and I think also being visibly Muslim in a way that my brothers themselves are not. So whenever there was a Muslim question in school, I was the only visible Muslim, and everyone came to me, from like kids to like professors. And I think being the only visible Muslim, I kind of just sucked it up, and I was like, I'm going to become an expert and I'm going to answer all of your questions. Like I was really that person. It was slightly ridiculous, but I think it did frustrate me that, for example, I would pray and I would look up, and in the window, I would see an absolute line of faces of people staring at me. And I'm like, I can't think about God in this way like this. And I mean, it would just be covered. And I was like, okay, people are staring at me weirdly. This is fun, I guess. Very unfun. But I think advocacy is such a major point, you know, and when things happen, like, who do you talk to, and who do you explain these instances to, and who do you unpack this with, other than just going home and saying, Mom, this happened, you know, and being able to turn to a teacher and say, I don't like how this thing happened, and having them address it with the class and not just that individual. And I think that's another thing that you were kind of definitely touching on, is the fact that there are these instances that happen to these individual Muslim students, but how is everyone else addressing it? How is everyone else getting taught to maybe not say these things, or maybe not speak about these kinds of perceptions, or let's change the perception of what a Muslim truly is, and what a person from this origin is, or et cetera, et cetera. And so thank you so much for sharing that. And Zahira, I'd love to pull it to you. You know, Amal spoke a little bit about police coming in and kind of that safety aspect, and how things are so far escalated. And you and I attended an event, don't remember the year, but it was by the ICA, and myself and Musa Magasa were moderating it on hate, racism, and Islamophobia. And there was a constable that came in, and they were speaking on what is a hate crime and what is not a hate crime, and what they can do about certain things and what they can't do. And instances like Zainab was talking about it, and I've experienced myself, where people are shooting die terrorists out of a car, not something people can apparently do anything about. When my hijab was ripped off, or when I was like absolutely cursed out on a public bus in front of people, no one really stood up for me, no one said anything. And so there are these instances when you're walking, when you're living, when you're existing, that make you question, will I feel safe? How do I feel safe? And so I would love you to touch on that, just about who protects us, and what does protection look like for us? And what do you think is necessary in order to achieve something like safety within this community for Muslims?
Thanks, Cecilia. So, I mean, that's a really important question, right? Who do we turn to when we've been hurt, when we've been harmed by Islamophobia or other forms of racism? And the simple answer is that there aren't many places that are safe or effective. And the ones that are, they're either not very well known or not very well resourced in order to provide like an effective response. So as a result, what we see is, as what Amal has described, right? So people mask their identities as a way to cope. And we're seeing a lot of this kind of self-policing. Where do we go? We don't go out. Do we go out in a group? Do we go out at night? How do we dress? Who do we associate with? What do we say? Or what do we even call ourselves, right? A lot of the self-policing to try to fit in, to try to keep ourselves safe, to try to make sure that we can protect ourselves and our families. And I think that kind of masks a broader question that we need to confront here, and I'm hoping we can begin to do tonight, which is that, you know, how do we begin to develop structures that support communities of faith, communities of color, when we do feel unsafe, when we do feel like we're not belonging, or when we are othered. The little that we know, and you know, the bigger question here, of course, is how little data there is around Islamophobia and around very specific and nuanced forms of racism across Canada, certainly in BC, and especially on the island and in Victoria. But the little research that we have locally here tells us that for most people who experience racism, healing and support and resources are found within their own communities. And then in fact, when they have turned to the police or to other forms of support, this has triggered a double harm. Either they were silenced, their concerns were minimized, or in fact, they were doubted and interrogated and re-traumatized by the experience because of who they were or because of some kind of unconscious bias or even less unconscious but very direct forms of racism that have been institutionalized within our police and within other structures that are meant to support and service us. And so while we know that the more physically violent forms of Islamophobia are considered a crime, other forms of Islamophobia, which are equally harmful, right, such as threatening behavior, slurs, for example, the things you've been hearing and reading about throughout this evening. For these types of behavior, there's very narrow avenues for reporting or for redress. And this is especially true of the subtle forms of Islamophobia, these kinds of microaggressions, the ones that might happen in unequal power relationships, for example, at work or at school, where even though there might be strong anti-bullying or anti-discriminatory policies, there might be an ombudsperson, for example, at university or at school, it's really difficult to speak up because you're already in a vulnerable space and because you have so much to lose if you do speak up and because you don't have that broader institutional support, advocates, and support of people who can hold you up and work with you towards redress. So there's a lot to be done to make us feel safer. There's a lot to be done, to confront Islamophobia in all of its different ways. I think the only kind of effective way to confront it is to dismantle the broader policies, the socialization, the curricula, the histories, the narratives that continue to reproduce racism. What we've been speaking about throughout this evening, that it's a form of racism. It's a form of dominant white capital. And beginning to confront Islamophobia can only happen when we begin to dismantle that broader dominant form of power that exists. And to get there, it is possible, though, right? But what we do need to do is to take like a million kind of small steps to normalizing Islam, right? To normalizing everyone and all identities that exist for so long on the margins that have been othered, and bring them into the center. So I think that's a helpful starting point to begin to kind of dismantle racism and lead to really effective and safe spaces for protection.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think, it's about turning to community, but I think as you're going to touch on later, it's not as easy as it sounds, just turning to your community, where the resources that community is there to support. I feel like a lot of communities that are supporting themselves are doing it out of pocket and out of hand, which we are willing to do and which we definitely will do for the sake of our communities, but we shouldn't have to. And so I think that'll be a further conversation. And so now at this time, I'd love to invite the audience and all attendees to populate the chat with questions that you'd love to our panelists to answer. And one thing I would love to even just mention, and I would love people's responses even on this, is Islamophobia itself, it's different than critiques on Islam. So if you yourself don't like Islam, that's okay. We're not hoping that everyone turns Muslim, and that's not what the end of Islamophobia looks like, is that we have a world full of Muslims. It's really not, it's really not kind of what we're speaking about here. What we're speaking about is when your either racist thoughts or thoughts of bigotry end up causing issues for Muslims and for Islam itself, because they are two separate things, Muslim and Islam, and the way people feel about them are sometimes the same, sometimes different. And one thing I think that is really big is even just when it comes to the way things are presented, so not just in media, but also from our higher ups, from people who are speaking about Muslims in the news. When Crystal spoke about London, Ontario, and what had happened there, and the family that was murdered there, and speaking about how that was, for the longest time, what the headline was in the media about just kind of attack, just like this random attack on families or this murder on families, and not outright calling it what it was, which is terrorism. And it's a constant thing that happens, that if it's perpetuated against Muslim people, then it's not terrorism. But if it's happens to be a Muslim person doing it, then it's automatically terrorism. And it's that kind of narrative that we have, and so unpacking that as well. I'm hearing that there's not a lot of questions, just kind of really thanking you all for the panel, because you're all sharing absolutely amazing things. And I want to thank you all also, and really put it out to the audience here to take what you hear, take the experiences that you're hearing, and not use them as kind of little points in conversation to say, well, this person had this really crappy experience, but to really sit with these experiences and recognize that these are humans experiencing them. They're Muslims, yes, but they're also humans experiencing these vast, disgusting acts of hate, whether it's being spit at, whether it's being your hijab torn off, whether it's being called a suicide bomber, and things like this. And I laugh because sometimes it's so funny when certain things happen, and it's like, but I'm not. So where did you get it? Because I don't have the energy. And I don't know if there's any thoughts that any of you have that you wanted to share in this time while we're walking through comments. Zahira, you disappeared on us. Amal?
Just another one of those like hilarious things that we always laugh about, but absolutely exists, is the whole airport situation. Like, it's a genuine problem. It's a genuine thing. Going to the airport, you're always just a little bit thinking twice about, will I be making it on that flight? Especially if you're flying through the States. Always a worry.
For sure, yeah, definitely. Airports are always fun. Definitely. And I think even I just totally lost my train of thought, but I'm reading this message from Paul about police board and just the instances that they're having and the responses that they're having. And I know that we're getting to recommendations soon. And so I'm wondering if people feel comfortable kind of just jumping there and sharing recommendations, and then maybe addressing more specific ones that seem to come through chats. Thank you so much, everyone who's sharing. I really appreciate it as well. And we've got some messages of that coming through. Yeah, Aisha, please.
I just want to share an example of a local police working together with the Muslim community from Surrey, something that I think is working well there. And it's essentially about relationship building. So there's a lot of funding and initiatives from the local police communities there, as well as not just the police boards and police committees, but also in between these most liaison types of committees. And there's two sides of it. One hand, sometimes I've been asked to be a part of some of these events and whatnot, and sometimes it does feel like it's kind of a checkbox, we're doing our part type of event or initiative. However, the most successful initiatives I have seen is in which community members, and especially for myself, I would consider myself a leader in the community. I take up a space and a responsibility as representing my community in different spaces. And so there's a lot of different spaces and opportunities for local police or local city boards or committees to go for coffee with someone and build that relationship, because there's a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and trust needs to be built in these relationships. Just doing a presentation for the sake of checking a box doesn't really help. Most Muslims, we know about Islamophobia. And so it's, you're preaching, we have a lot of sometimes preaching to the choir types of events and initiatives. But what I found the most helpful is genuine relationships. And there's a number of initiatives in which we could do that, but through official committees and boards, etc. But just I would recommend take the onus on yourself without being part of a board or a committee, and build a relationship with someone. And yeah, that's my 2 cents in story. There's a lot of initiatives in Surrey, such as Open Doors, where the community is invited into mosques and whatnot. And this is really endorsed and funded and supported by committees and the local city and the police boards, but also just casual conversations to build real relationships with real people in your neighborhood.
Thank you, Aisha. And I know that we were kind of moving on to that question about what Victoria can look like. And do you think the initiatives and projects and programs that exist in Surrey is something that's actually achievable here? I think that in the conversation that we're having, there are short-term and there are long-term goals, and there are things that we can achieve within the next few months or a year, and there are things that obviously would take a longer amount of time. And I'm wondering, what does that timeline look like to you? Do you think it's something that's short-term when it comes to the initiatives and projects? Do you think it's more long-term? Do you think it's a mixture of both? And where do you think Victoria is going? Where can it be?
definitely, I think this can be achieved in Victoria. Of course, Surrey being one of the fastest growing cities in Canada, and also many minoritized communities, or also marginalized communities, we owe a lot of debt to the very courageous Sikh community in Surrey. So they have been working for years, providing a lot of these community supports and kind of paving the way for other communities. So I think they've done a lot of great work that other communities, and myself for sure, I always see the Sikh community as an ally. You know, that's been really helpful in pushing a lot of these initiatives forwards, is when you see someone else role model it for you, you know, it gives you a lot of ideas of how you can do this for your own community. But the other thing is, like I mentioned before, one of the things that really appeals to my family and I is how kind and open islanders are generally, right? So I think with some work on really understanding positionality, privilege, and unconscious biases that we each have, combined with events and support and endorsements from the city and other committees, there's definitely so much potential here. And I don't think it has to be long-term. This is, there's a very young and vivacious community and energy growing in Victoria. I know everyone, you know, everyone who's like, you moved to Victoria, you're retiring, and that's been the joke. But I've been telling them, no, like the first two people I met in Victoria is Zahira and Sister Lisa, who I think is watching. I'm not sure, but shout out to her. And it was amazing within just very shortly of moving here, being pulled into that energy and joining a group of Muslim women who are going for hikes. And you know, it's a two-way street. You do have to put in the effort to be a part of a community, but in terms of can we see the initiatives that have taken place in Surrey, in Victoria? And do you think we'll see some results short term? Yes, I absolutely think there's a lot of potential for that.
Thank you so very much. And I'm genuinely loving the hope and the optimism that you have for this community. And I also think that there's a lot that we can do. And I think there's a lot that can change and that can happen short term and long term. And I know that there are so many bodies out there who are willing to make that effort. And so I also believe it can be a change. And thank you so much for bringing that forward. What I also would love to acknowledge is you bringing in the Sikh community. And I think something that I always, what always hurts me when I think about Islamophobia is that Islamophobia, unfortunately, and it's not that I want Muslims to suffer from Islamophobia, but unfortunately, Sikh and Sikh males specifically also suffer from Islamophobic actions simply because, for whatever reason, people believe that they present as Muslim. And I genuinely I always feel for that community having to suffer what it is that we suffer, not even because of who they are, but because, once again, who they're perceived to be. And we're not also attacked for who we are, but it's a different thing. And so I really honor you bringing them into this space. And I really just want to acknowledge those who have to suffer through situations like that and their allies continuously, despite wrongful hurt based on who they're supposed to be. So that's really amazing. And I just really want to offer one more time an ability for anyone to speak before we get into those really hard core recommendations. Crystal, if there's anything you wanted to share, reflections on how the conversation's going for you. Maybe.
Yeah, I think I'm just taking everything in, and I'm really honored to be in this space and to hear everyone's voices. And yeah, I really do appreciate you know, the optimism, you know, from you, Aisha, about like how we can move forward in making Victoria a safer place. And I hope that you find that optimism is sustained over a long period of time, and that you do see that change that you want to see. And yeah, I'm just really grateful. And I think I was thinking, you know, there are lots of other, you know, more sort of violent instances that I could have like gone over and really fleshed out in this session. But you know, I think that, you know, we get the idea, we get the picture of what's going on. So yeah, I think like kind of leaving it on a positive note of what we can do to come together and, restore justice and safety to our communities is really important.
Thank you, Stess. So now I guess I'll just really jump into these recommendations. And I know that this was inspired by the NCCM. And so the conference that happened in July of early this year in regards and in response to what happened in London, Ontario. And it was a call to emergency for the Muslim community in London, Ontario to come together and to discuss what needed to happen because too many deaths had happened and they were not willing to move forward without some sort of accountability from all three levels of government. And so they put together a report. And from that report, we were all inspired in this group. And thanks to Zahir for bringing it forward and suggesting it to also provide recommendations to the city of Victoria, because for the present moment in time, and hopefully for the future, it is currently our home and all we want to see is for it to get better. And so with that, I'll start with Amal and I'll just ask you, in regards to education, what is it that you want to see? What is it that we want to see as a Muslim community?
Sure, yeah. So I think the first point that I want to start off with is actually one that I did not include in the PowerPoint, but is one that I think can really be implemented in a relatively quick manner, because some of the asks obviously will take longer, but just in regards to like what I was speaking about and everything about how students literally are acting as a representative of their religion, race, culture, all of this, and they're so young and they don't have like a clear understanding of the world themselves yet, and then they don't have any support in doing that. So genuinely setting up something like, whether it be some sort of like informational classes or like someone that they know they can come to with like, hey, I keep getting asked this question. How do I address it? Like, how do I talk about this? Building a toolkit for them to be able to access the world with. I think that would be a really great first step to take, beyond even just like the next people stepping in and everything, because my next point would then be to actually have staff, like school staff, trained on what Islam is about and all those pieces. So things like that we consider to be, for example, when you go into school and you go to see your school counselor, if you're Muslim or you're coming from a different type of background, sometimes it can be hard to create that connection or communicate what you're feeling to this person because they don't have any idea about what your background is. So that would be another ask, is to have staff training on Islam, on what it's like to be Muslim. And then also provide training and resources for the staff themselves, so that going forward, after that they've like grown that understanding, they get a continued amount of training as world events happen and all of that. Another piece would be having a mechanism in place so that if a event happens, then how do we, an Islamophobic event happens, how do we address this? What are the steps? How are we acknowledging that it happened? What do we need to do to support the student? What do we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? So having those steps in place so that we know what to do when this comes up. And then finally, I think something that we all would love to see would be some review of curriculum. It's pretty sad to see sometimes in cases where up until now, our history textbooks are filled with things that it's like, okay, like where did this come from? Like finally now we're starting to see the slightest recognition in school teachings about the indigenous peoples and this massive part of our history that for so long was just erased. Like it was when I was in junior school and stuff, never heard about it, like never, not in a textbook. And it wasn't until years and years later that now we have these small pieces of it coming in. So I think in that way, like, yeah, adding these things to the curriculum, looking at the curriculum and saying like, okay, yeah, the pieces that are in here about like different faiths or different backgrounds, are they actually just negative things? Because sometimes that's the case where it's like the only time this race or religion or whatever it may be is brought up is in a negative light. And so it's like, okay, not very helpful. And then also just in that maybe highlighting people who represent the religion in a positive way. Like we have so many people like the person who developed the pinhole camera, I believe, he was a Muslim man. And so pieces like that, like obviously that may be not applicable to all textbooks, but things like celebrating these characters in history who are Muslim. Like we have some like phenomenal athletes who are Muslim. So let's mention that they're Muslim so that students who are Muslim themselves can feel pride in their religion when they're reading through these textbooks, and their friends also see that like, hey, like, look, this is a normal thing. Like Muhammad Ali, like he's like such a great boxer. Like he's Muslim. Like these people that can provide so much pride to students. We can bring it into the curriculum in so many different ways. So those would be my recommendations on how we can address these things in education as both like short-term possibilities as well as long-term goals.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And I think it's really interesting that you speak to, the individuals that are engaging within a school. But I think you've also really touched on representation as well, and representation in a way that isn't like having current people, but recognizing past people and past accomplishments. And it's not you asking for misconstrued or even like rose-colored glasses views of Muslims to just show all of their amazing things and only that, but we want a balance. We want both. And just same as every other peoples are shown. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Zara?
Yes, and I just have a last thought off of Amal's comments on education, and it kind of ties to representation. Sorry. I think I always come back to this proverb, I think it's called, but it's like, until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunter will always will be glorified. And so when we talk about representation and education, I think that's really key, and that helps me tie them all together. But some key aspects of visibility and representation is starting to integrate accurate representation and messaging on Islamophobia, white supremacy, respectful and authentic representation through public art, media, and community spaces. And, those instances of just calling Islamophobia what it is and naming it and calling it an act of terrorism or white supremacy, and making sure that language is really solidified when we're talking about representation, encouraging funding and actual capacity for public anti-Islamophobic campaigns within the city and within this community as well. Making sure that we incentivize and actually provide capacity for Muslims and Muslim artists to be able to explore their history and their artistry and build that within the city as well. And make sure that that's visible within public spaces as well. So within the media and public art. And for example, we've seen this in museums as well. And I think the Royal Ontario Museum has a dedicated Islamic curator. That's something that we've brought into some of our recommendations, that we've seen that actually enacted within the city. And when we start to think more tangibly, looking at ways to celebrate the Muslim community when we are also celebrating as well. So when we're celebrating Eid, then how can that visibility be brought into the city as well? And making sure that when we have these campaigns, what are those messagings that's going on within it? So how are those images, pamphlets or websites or billboards or all of those, how is that a representative of the Muslim community, and making sure that there's consultation with Muslim leaders and advocates to make sure that that's consistent.
Thank you, definitely. And you're right, it really does tie with Amal. And I think that really just goes to show that these are all intersectional pieces, and it's not about fulfilling one section or one area or one criteria. It's about working on all of it and building all of it as you go and build a community. And it's so important, the same in education, to see us Muslims as more than just, to see them as creators, to see them as public officials, to see them as just more than what we currently do, to provide pride for Muslims who are currently existing in this world, and also to provide a different narrative. And you touched on and definitely spoke to the importance of, calling it what it is. I can't say how, as infrequently as it happens, when it does happen, when something is called Islamophobia in the media, when something is named in that way, that in and of itself presents a sense of safety, of security. It lets me know that I am seen as a human being, and that what has happened not only is seen as hate, but is completely condemned. And that kind of brings safety to me. And so I'll leave it with Sahira in our final portion here, just about what safety in policing looks like, what safety looks like for Muslims, and what recommendations we have to bring forward there.
So, the recommendations here largely stem from what we've been speaking about all evening, which is, a reminder that the police, historically, structurally, politically, and purposefully was established to protect and further dominant interests. Largely, that means white male capital, right? Whether this was in the form of colonization or current forms of securitization, border control, anti-terrorism, it's a reality that we need to bear in mind. And so with that thought, and from that approach, then kind of any measures to review safety and policing, to redress and make communities feel safer, there needs to be both kind of like practical aspects, but there also needs to be an ideological shift that needs to take place. So with that in mind, kind of like 4 suggestions to consider. The first is, doing this kind of ongoing review and redress of racism within the police locally. The governance committee report for Victoria and Saanich already identifies kind of like 11 actions that need to be done to increase awareness and efforts to combat racism and focus on their language, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So centering community in these ongoing efforts that are currently taking place within the police, I think, alongside other things such as the workplace survey that they're doing, the training of the board, etc., centering community and the voices of community and the needs of community within these ongoing efforts, I think would be really helpful. There's a range of other actions that the police are currently engaged in as well. And I think having the police report back to community, engage with us as they develop these action plans, and as they report on progress on this would be really helpful. So for example, moving beyond some of the token representation to structural change, telling us how they're reviewing street checks, which is one of the action plans, looking at how they're understanding unconscious bias and what its role might be in profiling, for example, how the survey is developed, that's part of the action plan, and what it looks at. I think some of them, the detail and the nuance within these action plans, which are part of the kind of ongoing work of the police locally, would be really helpful. I do want to acknowledge that we have at least the Masjid Al Iman in Victoria has a really positive relationship with the police, particularly the police from Saanich and from Victoria. And so I think that relationship it's a really helpful start for expressing solidarity. And it's a really helpful resource for us to continue to use as we move towards more kind of meaningful change. And working with us and continuing to work with us to do this, I think is some of the next steps, right? Other things, for example, so again, this is from the action plan in the governance committee report for equity, diversity, inclusion, and engagement, having kind of like meaningful engagement and concrete actions there, rather than just being a tick box. So one of the recommendations that the NCCM does suggest, which we'd like to see locally, is like, for example, having within 6 to 8 months an anti-Islamophobia advisory council or circle that centers engagement with Muslims as part of that EDI update that the police are committed to. A third recommendation is reviewing municipal bylaws and powers so that public acts of harassment. We've spoken about and we've heard how a lot of acts of Islamophobia, of racism are dealt with, are happening on public sites in transit, on the streets, etc. But there's very little power to deal with it. So reviewing municipal street harassment laws, bylaws in particular, can be a helpful way to provide police with the authority to sanction and to deal effectively with harassment that takes place on the street. Similar measures have been adopted in Edmonton and in London, Ontario. And so it would be helpful to look at that and see if that's an avenue to look at locally here as well. And then finally, looking at things like reviewing funding for policing in municipal budgets, right? We've heard over and over again that communities seem to be the best resource to deal with supports that community members need. And so looking at where the money goes and seeing if things such as school liaison projects, for example, are necessary and meaningful for racialized communities, or whether funding can be redirected towards alternative measures for policing and for safety that really center community safety rather than authoritative reach of police in municipal budgets. So I hope these are some kind of more concrete recommendations that can help guide ongoing conversations between the city, between the police, and between Muslim communities.
Thank you, Zahira. And I think in general, just kind of from stories to structural change there, really what we're really asking for in a lot of ways is flexibility around who the community is. So I think any good community is one that moves and fluctuates with the community that actually exists there. And so as time passes and things change, the needs of that community changes as well. And so constant consultation and advice and conversation is so necessary in order to maintain these things. And grateful today, we've got Lisa Helps on the line. So Mayor Lisa Helps to address some of these recommendations that we have. And I'm so grateful for you sticking with us until basically 9 p.m. tonight to really talk about this. And I think one of the major things when we're discussing recommendations is, we provide things, and just for everyone to know, we will be providing a more formal write-up of what these look like, more in depth and more kind of thought out, with more consultation from the Muslim community as well as time goes on. But I think the biggest thing is, what does accountability look like? And when we ask these things, can we really expect for our city to show up, and in what ways? And so, Lisa, I would love for you to comment on these recommendations, what you see. Are these things you've heard before, and what do you think your role in the city is in regards to implementing some of the initiatives, projects, programs that we have put forward? Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I will reflect on the recommendations, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Welcoming City strategy, which is actually coming to council tomorrow. And I've just got it up here on my iPad. There are a couple of concrete recommendations that you've made that are already being recommended to council tomorrow. But if I could, Asiya, I just want to reflect a little bit on what I've heard tonight. May I do that very briefly? So we began today with a panel of Black activists and community members that created a Hope Meets Action, echoes through the Black continuum. That's how our day at CUIX Victoria began. And Charity Williams, who's a young Black woman who spoke on that panel, talked about emotional labor, the emotional labor that she needs to do as a Black woman, a young Black woman, constantly educating. And just some of the things that so many of you have said, this, self-policing to fit in, to become an expert, answer all your questions, even just Zara, when you talk about walking into a class and like basically having to educate your professor that you can understand English just fine, thank you very much. So I just want to begin by acknowledging all of the unnecessary emotional labor that you all have to do on a daily basis, and just really thank you for sharing that, and hopefully we can change the world and do away with systemic racism, so that unnecessary emotional labor, you don't have to do that. And then just going to this everyday racism, that racism is an ongoing reality. This is something that I heard over and over. And Zara also said that racism is rooted in colonization. And then, we have this notion, somebody said, sorry, I can't remember who, that, oh, well, this isn't really who we are as Canadians. We're not really racist. Well, Canada is built on colonization. And if racism is rooted in colonization, then therefore Canada is racist, like without question. And I think it's really, I really appreciate you all highlighting that, because this is who we are in Canada. We've got a lot of racism to unpack and do away with. And this is who we are in Victoria, as the ICA a survey showed. And Aisha, one of the things that really struck me that you said is, how is Islamophobia worse now than when you were in high school? I think that should really concern all of us. We're going in the wrong direction, and there's a lot to do. Crystal, thank you for your poem. I want to go and watch that again and again, and I will. And it just really struck me, two things you said: when we're used to grieving our people in silence, and then also you said, I deserve to be held with love, dignity, and awe. And absolutely, that is how each one of you deserves to be held. And Aisha, you said, you asked yourself at a certain point, what's wrong with me? And the answer obviously is nothing's wrong with you. There's a lot wrong with us. There's a lot wrong with us, and we have a lot of work to do. So I really just wanted to affirm that. I have more that I could say about, I took lots of notes and I wanted to make sure that I was reflecting back. I will obviously in just a moment go to the recommendations and they're important, but so too are your heartfelt experiences that you've shared with all of us, and wanted to take a moment to reflect on the personal elements as well. So to the recommendations, absolutely, yes, they're all very concrete and doable. Some of them the city doesn't have jurisdiction over, like education, but we can certainly pass them along to the school district as strong advocates for updating curriculum. However, in the Welcoming City strategy, and anyone who's interested, we're doing a session, Councillor Shamarke Dubo, who's also a Muslim, is the host of that panel tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And there'll be 3 people from the Welcoming City Task Force. And we've been working with BIPOC members of the community for the last year to develop a Welcoming City strategy to make Victoria less racist and more welcoming. And 2 of the things that you've mentioned, one is about education. And while we don't have exact control over the school district, one of the things that the people that we engaged with over the past year, that school is a really important site for inclusion, for breaking down barriers. And so one of the recommended actions is the city, in partnership, to work with parent advisory councils to establish newcomer support committees in schools to address newcomer family needs and provide mentorship, advocate for systemic change at school and with the Ministry of Education, create safe spaces for children in school, and form connections across schools to address shared issues. And then there's a whole bunch of measurables so that we'll know how are we achieving that. And so there's a little bit in there that already fits with one of the recommendations, which is to address the education system. The other one that a number of you brought up, and it's not specifically in your recommendations, but I think it kind of gets at it a little bit. One of the things that came up during the Welcoming Cities work, and this is recommendation 2.1, in partnership, the city to address a centrally located information hub for newcomers that provides access-free confidential services in multiple languages and media formats. And then number 2, a confidential reporting structure to record and address incidences of racism, fear-mongering, and barriers to access, discrimination, violence, or any other personal affront. And I think that's a really concrete recommendation that's in the Welcoming City Action Plan that I think addresses some of the recommendations that you've made as well. With respect to policing, you all asked me to invite our police board, and as you saw, a couple of members chimed in the chat. I think police is a key issue, and really think some of the conversations we had before this panel, where there's a kind of a governance structure is maybe too strong a word, but where there's a working relationship set up between the Muslim community and VicPD, building on the good relationship that's there to build mutual understanding, to train our officers, to train our board, to train ourselves. And so I think that is, yes, that's definitely doable. And I'm not sure if the chief is here tonight because I can only see all of you, not who else is here, but good thing this is recorded. We'll make sure that the senior police leadership looks at it. So yes, I think all of those recommendations with policing are implementable. With respect to visibility and representation, sorry, I shouldn't say all of those recommendations with police are implementable. The budget one is difficult because we are the police are asking this year for a cultural liaison officer, very specifically to be tasked to start to build these relationships. There are lots of other things that have to do with actual crime, like the cyber crime is an issue, and people, seniors are being defrauded with their credit cards. So there's a new cybercrime sergeant being requested to deal with that. So there are some places where more police funding is needed, but I think the points that you've made that we can create community safety in other ways by building relationships. The recommendations on visibility and representation, I think, are really important and very doable. One of the things that we were doing before COVID, we did it for 2 years in a row, is City Council invited members of the Muslim community through the mosque with Imam Ismail to have an iftar dinner at City Hall. And we did a press release, and then Imam and I were in my office talking about this, and there's a story in the newspaper about how the city is going to fast with the Muslim community and then break fast together together at City Hall. And those things are symbolic. They're not systemic dismantling. But I think that visibility and representation that you've recommended is very easy for us to do. And anytime anyone has any ideas about what we can do, then please let's do those things.
Sorry, would you mind if I just for a second, because something that you said, you mentioned about policing, and you said that it's just, for me, it's just a bit of a reflection. You said that there were actual crimes in which they needed funding for. And I think that word in and of itself, while I also agree that like credit fraud and things like that are obviously things that we need actions on, I think that's part of the problem of what we're discussing today when it comes to Islamophobia. These are crimes, not crimes when it comes to, for whatever reason, the legal stance, but they are instances in which are extremely important to the livelihood of how we exist and move throughout the day to day. And so while I completely understood what your intention was in saying that, even the statement of saying like, well, there are actual crimes, in a way almost diminishes the other instances of which we've shared today. And so I just wanted to as an offer, as maybe an unconscious one that came out, because I know you, so.
Thank you. I appreciate that. What I meant was actual crimes as opposed to mental health. Like there's a lot of police, so that I didn't mean actually, like obviously Islamophobia is a crime, hate is a crime. So all I was saying is, and thank you for calling that out, mental health is not a crime. Homelessness is not a crime. Like there are a lot of issues that police are currently policing that are actually not crimes, and they shouldn't be doing that work. So that's the distinction that I was trying to make, but I didn't obviously say that very clearly. So good for you for calling me out. I really appreciate that. And I think one of the things that was interesting in the recommendations is the review of bylaws. And I'm really curious to see what London and Edmonton are doing, because a lot of the things that are kind of hate crime oriented should be in the criminal code and should be treated as crimes. But if there are city bylaws that are also contributing to Islamophobia and to discrimination, then I think that's definitely something that we can review at a city level. I think I'll leave it at that. I did just maybe want to just reflect on something that Aisha said about the island being a kind and open place, and it's something good to build on. I think that's true, and relationships are really important. And we have a lot of work to do. And dismantling systemic racism and ending Islamophobia is my work. It's our work as settlers. It's our work as the white majority community. It's our work to do alongside with you, because I don't think it's fair or right or just that all the emotional labor has been carried by communities that we marginalize. And so that's my commitment and my reflection.
Thank you so much, Mayor Helps. I really appreciate the definitiveness in some of the statements that you made when you said that it is a crime, that it is hateful, that it is your job as well as our job to fix these things. And I think in words, those are the things we're looking for. And obviously we'll be following up when it comes to, what's it like, the welcome city welcome stuff with welcomes.
Welcoming city strategy. I'll put the link in the chat, but anyone who's, the chief is here. The chief has noted that he's here and listening. But yeah, I'll put it tomorrow at 5, we'll be having a panel where Welcoming City Task Force members themselves talk about the process and the experience and some of the recommendations.
Right. Yes. Okay. And I remember participating in some of those conversations. So I'm excited to follow up with that and see what comes of there. And then in addition to that, some of the other issues that maybe you'd stated that you yourself, obviously, as the council, don't have full effect and authority over, but might have influence over. And so I look forward to, how we as a city and we as a community can work together to kind of end some of these issues. And Zahira, I know that you yourself maybe had some final points that you wanted to raise. So thank you so much, Mayor Helps. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yep, thanks, Asiya. So I'll be brief. I think I just wanted to share some final thoughts. So as much as our panel today kind of centered certain Muslim voices, as represented on your screen today, and specifically looked at countering Islamophobia, we kind of firmly believe that this work furthers the struggle for equity and social justice for racialized, equity-deserving and marginalized communities across the city and the province. So this shouldn't be a Muslim problem. This shouldn't be an Islamic problem. This is something that's necessary, and this is important as part of the broader decolonial work that's needed across this country. And so with that in mind, it's important to look at this work on Islamophobia, against Islamophobia rather, alongside rather than instead of other efforts on anti-racism, and to work with rather than over other groups who are confronting and resisting racism, you know, in ways which make sense and which is possible given the emotional labor, as you said, that this involves. And so our final thoughts here really are in recognition of the work, the labor, the hours, the capacity, the organizing, the ideas, the resilience, the resistance that's needed if we are to move from symbolic support to long-term change that we so desperately need. And for this, we are offering and suggesting, you know, the need for a dedicated and resourced anti-Islamophobic structure at municipal level that can do a number of things. And I'll summarize 5 and leave it at that. The first is to drive the programs that are needed to normalize Islam, such as the public art installations that you've heard about in Surrey, in Vancouver, and across Canada. To understand the extent and forms of Islamophobia in other sectors and spaces, for example, such as healthcare, in transit spaces we haven't even got to, those of particular other women that have shared in the chat here as well. Second, to provide the consultation and advice that's needed for curriculum development from K to 12 and beyond. That's really necessary, that we can't do off the side of our desks. Third, to advocate and lobby for long-term structural changes in policies and laws, for instance, and for accurate messaging. There's still a lot of assumption, and we hear it creeping in over and over again in city documents, in speeches, that welcoming happens for newcomers, for refugees, when in fact racialized and Indigenous people born in Canada are still living disproportionately on the margin in multiple ways and still don't belong, right? So this whole rhetoric of welcoming and making Victoria inclusive still needs to be troubled in radical ways. Fourthly, to build solidarity and allyship with other communities. Again, coming from a colonial history, so often we fall into lateral violence where we put it against each other, and where very scarce resources need to be scavenged for, and we need to move away from that towards real solidarity. And finally, to ensure accountability. You know, I'm reminded today, this week, of the Prime Minister who went to Kamloops and honored First Nations there. And somebody who was in the crowd said, he's heard, but I don't know whether he's listened or not. And we'll only know if he comes back and he fulfills all of the commitments that we've asked for. And so I think similarly for us, ensuring that accountability happens through processes that can be set up so that we can come back to this moment and to see if there's been any of the meaningful change. I think that would be really helpful and important to us. But I do want to thank everybody for giving us the space. And so I'll give it back to you, Asiya, to round up.
Thank you so much to hear. And I think those last final points are things that we all echo. And I would love if there are any final words from all of you as well, if there's any final thoughts or things that you feel we haven't covered. And I really would also just really love to acknowledge the fact that yes, it was Mayor Helps who kind of responded to these recommendations, but it's not just on Mayor Helps to kind of implement and deal with these solutions. This systemic problem is a problem that is involved in all the different aspects of our society. And so I'm hoping that that means that it's all aspects of our society that will help to work on this. And as Sahira said, not in lieu of and not in separate from racism and all the other strategies that we're working on, but instead in collaboration with and just with Islamophobia as well in mind as another branch thereof. And so just to all my ladies, I'm wondering if there's any final thoughts that you'd like to enter this space, any final little keys of wisdom, beautiful things that we can hear from you all before we say salams. Mostly everybody's tired, and I respect that. So I will really just wrap this up and say thank you so much for everyone who attended. I really appreciate it. As was stated, this will be posted, this recording, and so you can refer back to this conversation as well as the recommendations from the summit, as well as our personal recommendations, which we'll be forwarding on to the city as well. And so we would love for you to engage with that content, download it, read it, contain it, refer back to it. And thank you so much for hearing and appreciating our stories. I'd like to once again acknowledge the fact that this conversation took place on the territories of Lekwungen peoples, and I thank them for this land, and I thank them for the opportunity to hold this conversation in that space and for us to do work on their territories and in their nation. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone. Peace be upon you, peace and blessings. I hope you have a really great evening. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Asiya.
I'm sorry.
You did great. Good night, everybody.